A new synthesis of genetic and archaeological data is forcing a dramatic rethink of our origin story. The evidence now converges on a startling conclusion. Modern humans were firmly established in Eurasia around 120,000 years ago, and they were not the evolutionary false starts we were once told they were. For decades, the media framed these early populations as failed migrations, brief excursions beyond Africa that left no descendants and no lasting impact. But fresh analysis of genomic signals, early interbreeding with Neanderthals, favorable interglacial climate windows, and Levantine fossil evidence is collapsing that assumption. The humans living across the southern and eastern Mediterranean during the last interglacial were not doomed pioneers who vanished without trace. They were part of a thriving, interconnected Afro-Eurasian population whose legacy survives in modern genomes today. What we are witnessing is not a minor update to the out-of-Africa narrative. It is a structural shift. The 120,000-year presence in Eurasia was not a failed experiment. It was the opening chapter of a much older, much broader human story. There is a strange moment in every scientific revolution when the data stop whispering and start shouting. In human origins, that moment may already have passed us. For decades, the story seemed clean. A small band of modern humans left sub-Saharan Africa around 60 to 70,000 years ago, interbred briefly with Neanderthals somewhere in the Levant, and then fanned out across Eurasia, Australia, and eventually the Americas. Earlier excursions were treated as failed migrations, interesting, perhaps even romantic, but ultimately evolutionary dead ends. But the deeper we dig, genetically and archaeologically, the more that tidy narrative begins to fracture. Around 120,000 years ago, during the last interglacial marine isotope stage 5e, the climate across North Africa and the eastern Mediterranean was warm, humid, and green. The Sahara was not a desiccated barrier, but a grassland corridor. The Levant was a mosaic of woodlands and lakes. Arabia was dotted with fresh water systems, and in that ecological window something profound happened. Modern humans were already there. This is not speculation. Fossils from the Levant, Skul and Kafsa have long been dated to roughly 90 to 120,000 years ago. Their morphology is unmistakably modern human, even if some retain robust or archaic traits. They were not Neanderthals. They were not transitional curiosities. They were Homo sapiens living in Eurasia during a favorable climatic phase that made movement between Africa and Eurasia seamless. The Mediterranean was not a border, it was a connective tissue. For years, these populations were dismissed as evolutionary ghosts. Failed dispersals, they said. They ventured out too early, were absorbed or replaced by Neanderthals, and left no lasting genetic legacy. Genetics was supposed to confirm this. And yet, buried within modern genomes, especially among Papuans and indigenous Australians, a small but persistent signal refuses to disappear. About 2% of their DNA appears to trace back to an early expansion out of Africa roughly 120,000 years ago. This component is distinct from Denisovan ancestry. It is distinct from the overwhelming majority of DNA tied to the later 70,000-year bottleneck. When researchers attempted to subtract known archaic components, they were left with a residual fragment that does not fit neatly into the standard model. Critics have argued that this signal could be statistical noise, a modelling artifact, or at most a tiny remnant, certainly not a demographic revolution. But even some of those critics concede that if such ancestry exists, it could be on the order of 2%. 2% may sound trivial. In evolutionary terms, it is not. 2% is the same magnitude often cited for Neanderthal ancestry in Europeans and Asians. No one calls Neanderthal introgression trivial. The real question is not whether the number is 2% or 0%. The real question is why such a signal appears at all if the Levantine populations were truly evolutionary failures. Now layer onto this the growing body of evidence for Neanderthal modern human interbreeding, not just at 50,000 years ago, but much earlier. Some genomic analyses suggest that gene flow between Neanderthals and modern humans may have occurred as far back as 120,000 years ago. That implies sustained contact. Contact requires overlap. Overlap requires presence. And presence at 120,000 years ago in Eurasia means that Homo sapiens were not a tiny African isolate waiting for a single heroic exodus at 60,000 years ago. They were already part of a broader Afro-Eurasian population network. The Levant, in particular, was not a peripheral corridor, but a central zone of interaction. Fossils from that region show modern human anatomy coexisting in time with Neanderthals. Climatic oscillations would have shifted population densities north and south, but the ecological continuity between North Africa and Southwest Asia during MIS 5E undermines the very idea of a hard continental boundary. The Sinai is not an ocean. The Mediterranean coast forms an unbroken arc from Morocco to Turkey. One of the most quietly devastating facts in this debate is the fossil record itself. The Levant has yielded multiple well-dated Homo sapiens individuals from roughly 90 to 120,000 years ago at sites like School and Kafze. These are not scraps or isolated teeth. They are partial skeletons, skulls, burials, clear, repeated evidence of sustained occupation. When you tally the number of securely dated Homo sapiens fossils from this small strip of eastern Mediterranean land, they rival, and in some time windows exceed, the contemporaneous record from much of sub-Saharan Africa. And when you expand the lens to include Mediterranean North Africa, sites like Jebel Irhoud, Dar es Sultan and others, the picture becomes even harder to dismiss. What emerges is not a thin trickle of adventurous wanderers who briefly stepped outside Africa before disappearing. It is a geographically continuous belt of Homo sapiens stretching from Atlantic North Africa through the Levant during the last interglacial. At that point, the term failed migration becomes almost absurd. You do not get multiple individuals, repeated occupations, burials, technological continuity, and interbreeding with Neanderthals from a demographic mirage. You get a population that was established, adapted, and very much at home in the Mediterranean world 120,000 years ago. If Homo sapiens were present in the southern and eastern Mediterranean 120,000 years ago, the question shifts dramatically. Instead of asking, why did early migrations fail, we must ask, why do we assume they migrated at all? The phrase out of Africa embeds a geographic assumption that modern humans evolved in sub-Saharan Africa, then exited into a fundamentally separate Eurasia. But Africa and Eurasia are not isolated land masses. They form a single continuous Afro-Eurasian supercontinent. During humid phases, North Africa was ecologically more similar to the Levant than to equatorial Africa. The Mediterranean basin functioned as a biogeographic unit. What if Homo sapiens evolved not in an isolated southern refuge, but within a broader Mediterranean Levantine North African metapopulation? In such a model, the 120,000-year presence in Eurasia is not an early failed migration. It is simply the northern expression of a population already distributed across interconnected ecological zones. The genetic evidence complicates the orthodox narrative even further. If Papuans retain a 2% signal from an early dispersal, this implies that at least some lineages connected to the MIS 5E population survived and contributed to later expansions. They were not erased. They were folded into subsequent demographic waves. Moreover, Papuans also carry Denisovan ancestry, suggesting prolonged interaction in Southeast Asia. That interaction must have involved human groups capable of reaching Wallacea and Sahul long before Europe was fully colonized by the later Upper Paleolithic wave. The cognitive, technological and maritime capacities required for this dispersal do not fit neatly into a sudden 60,000-year explosion. They suggest deeper roots. Archaeology reinforces this. Sites across Arabia and the Levant, dating to around 120,000 years ago, contain stone tool assemblages associated with Homo sapiens. In some cases, these industries share affinities with North African technologies, implying population continuity across what is now desert. During MIS 5E, that desert was grassland. If the Sahara was green, if the Levant was hospitable, if Arabia had lakes, then the environmental barriers invoked to explain isolation dissolve. Neanderthals, too, were not confined to Europe. They ranged into Western Asia. Genetic studies indicate that some Neanderthal populations received gene flow from modern humans more than 100,000 years ago. That gene flow cannot occur in the absence of sustained coexistence. And here lies the biggest structural problem for the classic model. If this 120,000-year-old Eurasian population did not completely fail, if it contributed even a small but measurable portion to later populations, then the so-called 60,000-year out-of-Africa event cannot be what it is claimed to be. It cannot represent the first successful entry of modern humans into Eurasia. It would instead represent a demographic re-expansion from populations already established across the southern Mediterranean and Southwest Asia. In that light, the 60,000-year pulse looks less like a heroic departure from an isolated homeland and more like a rebound after a climatic bottleneck. One obvious candidate for such a bottleneck is the Toba super-eruption around 74,000 years ago. Whether Toba caused a near extinction or a severe regional contraction remains debated, but there is little doubt that climatic instability intensified during this period. Populations in Arabia, South Asia, and perhaps even parts of Africa would have faced ecological stress. Refugia would have mattered, connectivity would have narrowed. If Homo sapiens were already widely distributed across North Africa, the Levant, and into parts of Asia before Toba, then a subsequent climatic downturn could have reduced those populations dramatically. Survivors in certain refugial zones, perhaps along coasts or in stable river valleys, could then have expanded outward again when conditions improved. That expansion, dated genetically to around 50 to 70,000 years ago, may reflect the growth of one surviving branch of a broader Afro-Eurasian population, not the initial exodus from sub-Saharan Africa. In other words, what we call out of Africa may in reality be a post-bottleneck reorganization within an already connected Afro-Eurasian world. This reframing resolves several tensions at once. It explains why early Levantine fossils exist. It accommodates signals of early Neanderthal admixture. It allows for small but persistent genomic traces of deeper dispersals. It contextualizes the 60,000-year genetic signature as a major expansion event without requiring that it be the first and only crossing of a continental boundary. Most importantly, it dissolves the artificial wall between Africa and Eurasia that has shaped the narrative for decades. During humid interglacials, that wall did not exist ecologically. Populations moved, mixed, and adapted across a continuous landscape. If Homo sapiens were already embedded within the southern and eastern Mediterranean 120,000 years ago, then the 60,000-year expansion cannot logically be framed as the moment humanity left Africa. It would be more accurate to describe it as the moment one lineage expanded disproportionately after surviving climatic contraction. That distinction is not semantic. It reshapes the entire map of our origins. Africa remains central to the story, the deepest genetic lineages traced there. But the model of a single, late, decisive departure from a sub-Saharan cradle into an empty Eurasia becomes increasingly untenable in the face of fossil, climatic and genomic data. Instead, we are left with a more complex and more compelling picture. A Mediterranean-centered Homo sapiens population present by 120,000 years ago, interacting with Neanderthals, adapting to interglacial landscapes, contracting during climatic stress, and re-expanding around 60,000 years ago in a wave that would dominate later genetic signals. In that framework, the early Eurasian populations were not failures. They were the foundation, and the 60,000-year event was not a first step out of Africa. It was the resurgence of a population that had never been confined to it in the first place. Thanks for watching.